Welcome to the Red Light Exposé podcast.
We are an international grassroots survivor-led circle.
Our goal is to counter the growing acceptance of sex work ideology.
We aim to raise awareness of the harms of commercializing sex, meaning prostitution, porn, stripping, and BDSM.
Through honest, in-depth conversations, we elevate voices often ignored and silenced.
Together, we're challenging stereotypes and dismantling myths.
We envision a healthier, safer society, especially for girls and women.
We appreciate your company on this journey.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Red Light Exposé. My name is Andrea Heinz and I am one of 8 hosts on this podcast project where we shine a light on the harms of commercial sexual exploitation. I've come to this work through my own experiences. From 2006 to 2013, I endured 7 years in Edmonton, Alberta's city-licensed sex industry as a young woman facing deep economic hardship. I have now been exited for 13 years. Since then, I've married, become a mother to 3 incredible children, and have focused my efforts on confronting exploitation and trafficking through writing, public education, and survivor-centered advocacy. Today, we're going to talk about something difficult but critically important: the hidden ways institutions can allow abuse to happen and how vulnerable individuals are often overlooked, disbelieved, or left without protection. Even though the systems may look different, exploitation and abuse often share something in common: institutions that fail to protect the vulnerable, cultures that silence victims, and power structures that shield perpetrators. That intersection is what brings us to this conversation. To help me explore these issues, I'm honored to welcome our incredible guest, Tim Lennon. Tim is an author and longtime advocate for accountability and reform, and he wrote the powerful book, Stand Up, Speak Up: How Survivors Created a Movement to End Sexual Violence. His work shares not only his own story as a clergy abuse survivor, but the story of how many survivors of sexual abuse found one another, found their voices, and built a movement that challenged some of the most powerful institutions in the world. Tim has devoted more than 30 years to helping survivors and promoting systemic change. He's been deeply involved with Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, known as SNAP, since the mid-1990s, serving on the board for over a decade, and as president from 2018 to 2021. Through that leadership, he's helped create community for survivors, expand support networks, and push for meaningful accountability and change. Tim brings compassion, clarity, and hard-earned wisdom to this conversation, and we're truly grateful he's here to share it with us today. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this important conversation.
Thank you. So glad that you can be here today, Tim. Before we begin, a gentle note to our listeners. This episode includes discussion of sexual abuse and clergy misconduct. Please take good care while listening. If you or someone you love needs support, you can find survivor resources and peer support through SNAP at snapnetwork.org/resources. So, Tim, thank you again for being here. Before we start, I want to say that thank you first and foremost for sending me a copy of your book to read. I found it incredibly inspiring, really all the emotions all at once. And as we were talking about before we hit record here, I had a really hard time reading the book at the beginning. So the beginning of the book, you courageously and vulnerably share your story of being victimized by Father Peter B. Murphy, who was an assistant priest at your parish and a family friend of your parents. And I've read a lot of accounts of survivor stories, and yours, I don't know if it was how you wrote it or just the gravity of the violence that you endured by this man, but it was really hard, and I found I had to keep putting the book down and just kind of grounding myself and taking a breather from that reading. But then later throughout the book, I had this total transformation also of like empowerment and hope and a vision for a better future. So I just really want to say, I know it's not easy to write a book, having just done so myself a couple years ago, And so I just really want to, honor your courage and your vulnerability and say thank you for putting together such a brilliant piece of writing that I know is going to really help serve others in understanding this issue and moving towards their own healing as well.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate the compliment. And I just wanted to document how survivors are creating a social movement. So this is a grand, hopeful new era where survivors are stepping up and forming organizations to fight back.
Yeah, it's quite brilliant. And there was something that you said in the book that I thought was really interesting and quite shocking, actually, as well, too, was that you said that most childhood sexual abuse victims, the average age of disclosure is actually around 52 years old. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. That came from an organization, Child USA. You can find them at childusa.org. Their study showed that the average age is 52. I think some of my memories came forward when I was about 47, I believe, and the other memories came forward, the worst memories, the violent memories, came forward not until I was 63.
Wow, that's quite remarkable. That's quite staggering. And one thing I really took away from your book as well, too, as someone who experienced commercial sexual exploitation for 7 years, was the parallels of what you discuss in this book and what those in the commercial sex industry experience as well. So as I was reading it, there was so many points where I thought Tim could just change out, talking about clergy abuse and talk about commercial sexual exploitation. And it really felt like it was all one and the same. So I think that really speaks to the universality or the transferability of these issues and the underlying nature of how they're allowed to occur. And so I will get into that a little bit later too, but we know obviously a lot of those that are in the commercial sex industry, they never disclose either, or they wait many years and it takes that long for many of them to process what has happened to them and contextualize it in their life and their larger experiences that they've had. And one thing that you say in the book is that touching those painful memories is like grabbing a hot skillet without a hot pad. I want to say, I felt very seen and very heard, even as someone who was not a clergy abuse survivor, but really found that your book was able to resonate with my experiences surviving commercial sexual exploitation as well.
When we bring forward painful memories, it's an opportunity for us to address those memories and incorporate them as part of our life. If we continue to bury them, then they constantly interact on our behavior, whether it's depression or self-harm or drinking or whatever, because we want to bury those harmful memories. But when we bring harmful memories forward to become part of our life, then we can move forward. We can have a fuller life. We become our true selves and not have what happened to us control our life. So it's quite liberating to step forward and not bury memories.
Yeah, very cathartic and freeing. And even though it may be difficult to initially approach those memories and touch on them for the first time after they've been buried so long, it really is, like you said, so important to integrate that into our path forward to be our whole true selves and to honor what has happened to us that has inevitably led to our understandings of things and our opinions and how we view the world. It's very well said. I do want to say, I know that it's probably still, after all these years, challenging to share your story. I don't imagine it ever gets easy to talk about what you've endured. And so I just really want to say again, thank you for, coming and being willing to talk about this, because I think a lot of people don't talk about it because there isn't a lot of places that they feel like they can do so safely. So I want to really pass it over to you and let you walk us through the story. And I really encourage listeners to purchase your book and to read it, because you, again, do just such a powerful job taking the reader through that experience of you at age 12 when you experienced this happening. Please only share what you're comfortable with, but I'd really appreciate if you could let us know how it came to be that you were affected this way.
Well, as an advocate working with SNAP, working with survivors, I can't say I'm comfortable sharing my story because sometimes it can be very difficult. But I was raised in an Irish Catholic family in the Midwest in Iowa. I was very religious growing up as a child. My parents are very religious, went to church every Sunday, went to Catholic grade school. A new priest came in and sexually abused me. Found out later he abused many boys. And even later I found out that this priest had been moved 3 times previously for sexually violating kids. And then when he got caught, that was the only reason my abuse stopped, was he got caught by another parent and sent away. So here's a priest who the Catholic Church knew to be an abuser, moved him 4 times after he sexually abused kids. He started with older kids, but they fought back, so he moved to younger and younger. I was about 12. I may have been 11, but about 12 years old. And when it happened, I didn't understand it and said nothing and did nothing. And of course, there is a great amount of authority given to priests in the Catholic faith. As I said, I was raised in a very religious environment. And when the abuse happened, I didn't understand. And when I endured a very violent, life-threatening rape, I don't want to get too explicit, but it was quite horrible. My thought was, why is God doing this to me? I had put so much into my faith and being raised as a Catholic. I couldn't understand because I saw this priest as representing the Catholic Church, but I was suffered incredible harm, and I didn't understand it, and came up with the question is, why is God doing this to me? I related to him as a representative of God. I endured several months of abuse. I don't know if the rape was the start or it was the end. I have a disconnection with that, but that's not unusual with victims of child abuse, as memories can be disjointed. But I had buried those memories for 30 years, didn't tell my family, didn't tell my friends. I, looking back, suffered for many years as a result of that abuse, of academically failing at the bottom of the list of other students in my class. But when I was mid-40s, I was with my wife at the time and driving past the cathedral in San Francisco where I lived. There was a demonstration, a SNAP demonstration, protesting a priest that had abused a child. I stopped, and that's when my memories returned. And I began my activism with SNAP, was active with them on a local level, participating support groups. And then after 3 years of advocacy, sort of felt better. My wife and I had twin daughters. However, when they turned about 8 or so, 9 years old, 10 years old, it evoked memories of the rape. The memory of how could someone harm a child? I even to this day, when you look at children and you think, how could someone so grievously harm a child? And it caused such emotional upset. I had to quit my job. I was crying all the time. I re-engaged with therapy, especially EMDR, and I became a full-time volunteer with SNAP as a way to fight back. So between having the ability to do something concrete as opposed to blaming myself or carrying a burden of what happened to me as my fault, I was able to say this happened to me and that I want to prevent what happened to me from happening to any other child. So my advocacy with SNAP was based on this anger. Survivors of sexual abuse sometimes can be consumed by anger, and it can destroy their life. Like a sparkler, it goes everywhere, against family, against friends, but mostly it harms the survivor. So I have used my incredible anger, and I'm very, very angry, for advocacy. And so since 2008, I've been a full-time advocate and activist fighting against sexual abuse. And eventually, after my work with SNAP, that's when I began researching my book. So it's kind of a trajectory there of how I was abused at 12 years old to today of my advocacy.
It's quite a transformative journey, very much so.
Yes. And I'm fortunate because we know that victims of sexual abuse, barely 10% ever come forward. And it's so important that victims talk to a friend, share with a friend, share with a family member. Well, this is something that happened to them, that this wasn't caused by them, that there's a path forward, that you can get support.
Yeah, that's quite remarkable. And I agree with you. And I've seen that again in my respective space of activism that a lot of people have anger, rightly so, after being victimized. And I myself have felt red hot anger. And I think you actually use that term in your book, red hot anger. And whenever I read that, I thought, oh, that's such a good way to articulate it because it's not just frustration or annoyance, like those levels of anger. It is at times all consuming where you almost feel like, how can I go on? How can I ever laugh again? How can I ever trust people again? How can I ever just have this life that I was intended to live, given that this happened to me? And if you don't have a way to channel that anger, either through art or, like poetry, writing, as you said, like it sits in you and it can really paralyze you from moving forward and reclaiming your power and embodying that in its fullest and feeling like there's actual action that you can take using that anger for good.
And I just wanted to point out that we call ourselves survivors because there's a large percent of people that have been harmed by sexual violence do not survive, whether it's through suicide, that's the most extreme, but other forms of self-harm or alcoholism or anger of destroying relationships or inability to have relationships, that all these things that are taken in by us are harming us or whatever. So it's important to understand that there's a path forward, that we survived the sexual harm that happened to us.
Yeah. In chapter 5 of your book, you say that childhood sexual abuse is associated with a 3.5-fold increase in the odds of suicide attempts. And when I read that, I was not shocked to hear that, as well, many of the individuals who are in the commercial sex industry, as you probably know, are victims and survivors of childhood sexual abuse or childhood sexual exploitation. And for them, it's the exact same thing. We see a very, very high suicide rate in this space of those who are active still in the sex industry or those who have exited. And I think that really loops back to what we're saying is you have to find a way to channel such powerful energy. And, anger, like you said, can destroy relationships. It can destroy us from the inside out, but it also has really a power that no other emotion has to be able to incite change and mobilize action and get people just really riled up to really empathize, I think, with those experiences of children and vulnerable people who have been victimized and really take that to run with it for good rather than letting it kind of implode upon itself within people. So yeah, I wasn't surprised to hear that. And, talking to you, like, I'm not only just happy that you have found this, but I'm really happy that through your book, you've been able to let other survivors know this is possible. You can find that type of channeling of this very powerful emotion for good. I think your book, for that reason alone, is just so important for people to read because it confronts the injustice, but it also incites hope in people, which is something I think a lot of us don't have.
Right. And I think that was one of the purposes of writing the book. In other words, as survivors, we face the world as individuals. A lot of us are fortunate that we work in other organizations or have productive work that is outside of ourselves, like you as a broadcaster. But it's so important that people know that there's an opportunity for change, that they're not alone, that there's millions of us, and that, as I point out in my book, that there's hundreds of organizations that do the work in all the different kinds of fields of whether it's in clergy abuse or it's sports or it's in adults or it's in Boy Scouts. On my website, standupspeakup.org, I have a list of 200 national organizations that are active in organizing survivors and changing the world in all different categories of social life.
Yeah, I was really, really actually taken aback with the extensive research that was part of your book and the resources, like so comprehensive in how you put that into the book. I think whenever I first got the book, having followed you on Twitter for quite some time, I thought, okay, this is probably going to be more of like a autobiography. And then there'll be one chapter at the end where he lists some resources for people. But it was very little actually about your personal story. Like the beginning it was, and it's so hard hitting, like I said, but it very quickly in the book transformed to the bigger picture of these issues. And I really, appreciated that you drew attention to so many survivors. You talked about Andrea Constant, who was the woman who went up against Bill Cosby, some of the gymnasts who were going against Dr. Larry Nassar. You spoke about Lizette Martinez, who challenged R. Kelly. I learned so much more about the bigger picture, like I said, and I thought it was just really, really remarkable how much attention you drew to patriarchy and these systems, and then the survivors, and then extensive resource listing. Like it really almost felt more kind of like an encyclopedia. I don't know how to describe it, but it didn't really feel like a narrative book, but it didn't feel like a textbook because it had a lot of warmth and humanity in it. I've never read a book like it. It really, really transformed my heart in many ways reading it.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that. Well, one thing I want to point out, and that is in my website or the book, hundreds of survivor organizations. But I'm outraged at popular media, mass media, the newspapers, the TVs. 1 out of 4 women are sexually abused, 1 out of 6 men. Why isn't that on the front page in every magazine, every newspaper, every TV newscast? Why isn't that a big story? To me, it's outrageous. So when people read my book, this is a common theme. They say, I didn't know there's so many different organizations. But there's hundreds of organizations, national organizations. I'm not talking about the thousands of Instagram groups and other forms of local action, just nationally. So there's a huge movement. It's just that we don't hear about it. And so that was one of the purposes of the book, is that we are a movement, that there is change happening, that there is a future, and that the mass media only covers the spectacular in general. Man abuses a woman. Well, man abuses a 60-year-old. Newscasts call it a woman, but really it's a child. Man sexually abuses a child. That's not the headline. So media, I'm pretty outraged at. Now, we do have, thankfully, different points where there's a lot of news and interest, like the gymnasts, or we see that Weinstein or Cosby, as you mentioned. And more recently, we see with Epstein and the courageous victims coming forward with the revelations. And it takes incredible courage for these women to stand up. But they do so much for the rest of us to say, you're not alone, that there is hope, that you can fight back. So it's good in the sense that there's this movement. It could be better if there was more notice within mass media about it being actually a movement. That's my soapbox.
So that's a good soapbox to stand on. And I'm with you on that. And I think, definitely all of us that are hosts at this podcast project, we take a very critical eye to media. And we often, on our live streams that we try to do once a week now, have an article that we bring to the table, and we read out the article by mass media and dissect it and what the underlying tone is and the message and how are people actually inferring this with what they're saying and the language that they're using. And we still have so far to go when it comes to media accurately reporting on things and using appropriate language. And I think to the Epstein case, I saw an article where I think it was Quentin Tarantino, the filmmaker, to the media. He was in an interview and he just completely discredited the child victims of Epstein. And he said that they were just young party girls or, looking for a good time. It was something horrific. I can't remember exactly. We'll have to maybe do that on our next live stream and dissect that. But I thought, here's a guy with huge power, huge money, huge influence. And all he says is just a couple lines about this, which I don't agree with, obviously. But media just took it and it was on the front cover of everything. He doesn't think it's legit. And meanwhile, you've got, however many victims, dozens upon dozens of Epstein victims that have come forth courageously. are saying, this happened to me, this is the reality. A lot of them have information that others wouldn't have if they were making up this story. Yet here we profile this rich, wealthy man who, has power and influence, and his word dominates the media, and really serve to undermine all the real strong storytelling and courage that these women brought forward, and these young boys too, to talk about Epstein. And it just reminded me like how far we still have to go in media, that we give equal weight to both sides of the story. Like, yes, I don't agree with anything that Tarantino said there, but I'm also not for silencing people. So if that's what he wants to say, that's his prerogative. But when you don't hear the actual survivor account, and when it's really muffled by these powerful people with influence and money saying their nonsensical stuff, one side of that conversation totally gets lost. The public doesn't hear it. It influences them in the wrong way, right?
Well, basically, it's the power of patriarchy and male chauvinism, where they dismiss the value of women, where those that have power wish to maintain and reproduce their power. So male chauvinism and patriarchy control the media, control the message. And thankfully, we have your show and other mechanisms for us to fight back against that power. And so it's a never-ending struggle of that kind of dismissal of women and women's stories, and continues a system where women are exploited. And it's not just a mechanism of replacing one leader with another, but it's changing who we are as society and the values that we appreciate, and then having that expressed in the actual system itself. So we may have the power of the people, but we don't have power of the mechanisms of society.
And that really, goes with, again, my vision of us coming together for this conversation is to talk about those systems and those mechanisms and the institutionalization that we see, where really it's defeating as a survivor, because you really feel like it's a David and Goliath battle, that you're up against this machine of misinformation and patriarchy and male chauvinism and everything that you talked about here. And yeah, as a woman, reading your book was just so affirming too. Like, I really liked all that you drew to the attention about the women's struggle and how that's so correlated to this. Like in chapter 7, you say, quote, "The child abuse prevention movement, the women's movement, and the survivors movement share mutual and complementary interests in each other's success. Each movement bolsters the work of the other." And I thought, wow, that is just such a beautiful way to put it, that there's this united energy, even though we're all fighting these unique niche issues in our own right. We're all really fighting the same thing at the end of the day. It's all the same beast that we're going up, almost like this good versus evil energy. And I just thought it was so refreshing to read the work of a man who could write and contextualize that and put that together, and not look at it through a patriarchal or male chauvinistic lens, which we do see in a lot of these spaces, unfortunately, that there's still that gap that's missing with some men to really sympathize and empathize with women and our movement as feminists to try to dismantle patriarchy, and seeing that as part of that, one key part of, moving forward in a positive way. So that was really just fantastic for me in your book as well. That really stood out a lot.
Well, thank you.
We want to take a moment to thank you for your listenership. As an independent volunteer collective, our episodes are only made possible because of donations from people like you. Please visit our website, www.redlightexposé.com, and click the Donate tab. There, you can find ways to financially support us one time or on a monthly basis. Your support is greatly appreciated. And now, back to the episode. Again, I could ask you so many questions about your personal story, but I really do want people to read your book, to hear that. And like you said, it's, one of those things that it's difficult to talk about, and there's so many layers to it as well. But I do, before we move forward to talking about institutional complicity and these societal enablers, I do want to ask, like, as a child, how that felt, that you were violated by somebody that was so well respected in society, respected by your family, close to your family. Do you think that, understandably, if so, added another layer of harm to you, the fact that this was somebody close to you, that there was this relationship of trust? Or do you think that the harm is universal either way, whether it's a stranger or somebody that's very close to the family or the child? Do you see a difference in the abuse and the origins of it and how that impacts survivors?
Well, there's a number of questions in that, but my first impression of the abuse was equivalent of being standing in the middle of the road and getting hit by a truck, meaning I had no ability to understand what it was, what it meant, what was happening, what the effects. And at the time, as a 12-year-old, I was totally at loss, and it totally, I was going to say disrupted my life, but I would say ruined my life until I had to bring those memories forward to become part of myself. In between time was a time of depression and being isolated and self-blame. Those decades were kind of a fog. And my life, my academic life, my social life, my family life, all sort of disappeared. Yeah. I don't know how much I can share because to me it's incredibly sad and it's incredibly depressing to look back to that period. And I can only be thankful that I came out of it or came forward or became myself. I don't know if that answers your question, but it wasn't like there's any kind of thought or logic or philosophy or anything that would happen to me between 12 and 43.
Yeah, no, that's totally understandable. And I think the reason why I asked that question is because I think that there's always this eagerness in society to compartmentalize systems of harm and acts of violence as this was worse than this, or at least this never happened to you. So what happened to you, you shouldn't be complaining about it because it could have been worse. And I think what spurred me to have that question for you of, was it worse being somebody so close to you and your family was in chapter 6 when you talk about how your abuser, Father Murphy, was profiled by the Diocese of Sioux City in a book where they referred to him as the one who, quote, most resembles Jesus.
Oh, God.
This was after they knew that he was a predator. When I read that, that boiled my blood. I think that was probably the most angry I've ever been reading anything in my life is these people knowing that this man is a serial child abuser and then they have the nerve to say that he most resembles Jesus and giving him this exalted kind of godlike status, which really has an impact on those that he has victimized. To hear somebody refer to him that way, and I just thought, oh my gosh, I think there's got to be some kind of fear of a stranger attacking you. But to hear somebody say that about somebody who has violated you so horrifically and then just acting like that's okay, this is normal. He's godlike. I just thought, wow, the rage, that must be at a whole nother level of feelings of violation and abandonment by those that are supposed to actually care about youth and look out for them. So yeah, I understand what you're saying, and I totally can appreciate that it probably doesn't really seem to be different. It's all, one act of violence, but I just thought that must have been something extra that many survivors probably don't experience, is this exalted status, this honoring of an abuser at your expense, really.
I had found that description 10, 15 years after my abuse when I was researching my story because I had buried so many memories. I felt compelled to understand what happened and what happened to me. And so I began to do some research. I put in ads in local newspapers in Iowa, where I grew up, in maybe 6, 7 different newspapers. And I said, do you know Father Murphy? If you know him, I'm interested in learning more. It wasn't too much different from that, just little personal ads. And I did that in 6, 8 different newspapers. I got 6 replies. 4 of them were victims who told me their stories and shared their stories. And so I knew that the first time that he was assigned to a parish, he abused a child. And so the church knew at that moment that he was abusing children. And they transferred him to another parish. He abused another child. The church knew. So twice. Well, 2 times this priest has abused children. Don't you think there's a problem? No, they transferred him to another parish. And the interesting story on the third parish, he was assigned to a parish and also to a high school. And he abused this young woman. She fought back, and he had somehow, in trying to abuse her, cut her, whatever. She reported it to her high school priest or whatever. They did nothing. But the church did, so this is the third time, the church did move him to my parish, where he raped and abused me when I was 12. When I did research later, 30 years later, as I started out, I did those ads. I also put ads in local papers, did a press conference. There's about a dozen in Sioux City, my parish, in addition to the other smaller towns, people who were in my grade school who were also abused. But I was the first time anyone knew about him until I did a public statement saying I was abused. Then a dozen others came forward. So we know that statistic is for every child that we know is abused, there's another 9 that we don't know about. So we can assume this Father Murphy had abused several in each of the previous parishes, as well as the 9 that came forward to me in my grade school that said that they were abused. And then he got caught. That was the reason my abuse stopped. They transferred once again.
Oh, I'm so angry hearing this, that they know this. And I want to move to what you talk about as the playbook that the church has used. But before doing that, I want to say in, I think it was chapter 11 of your book, you said that the organization Bishop Accountability's documentation reveals that about 10% of clergy are abusers. So if you think if Father Murphy had a minimum of around 15 victims, there's probably more, but 15 that you were aware of that came forward, how many of these 10% of clergy abusers, how many victims does that equate to across the board? Like, the numbers are staggering when you think about it. It's not an isolated one-off kind of thing with one bad bishop. It's like prolific that it's going through these institutions. Is that safe to say that's correct?
bishopaccountability.org. You can go there and they have statistics by states and you can look it up. I'm unsure, I didn't prepare enough here, but I don't know if Canada is listed on Bishop Accountability. I'm assuming they have, but you can look up by parish and you can see the number of abusers, and they point to 9,000. Other statistics points to 100,000 children have been sexually abused within the Catholic system. This is since 1945, typically after the war till today. I could go on, but yeah, there's too many.
Yeah, and just keeping on this theme of numbers, one report that you talk about in your book, I think it came out of Texas, detailed that there were 380 abusive Baptist pastors in 20 states over just 20 years. So again, if we're thinking that there's multiple victims, like the numbers of what you said, even still with that seem low. It sounds like there's, tens of thousands potentially, if not more, of people. And so many, again, that don't come forward, like you said, or wait so many years to come forward that we really probably don't understand the scope of these types of things.
It's like an iceberg. You only see just part of it. And the community within the Baptist faith is just now beginning to expand and explore. So these are all unexplored kind of continents where we know that we're just seeing that top of the iceberg part where the problem is hidden from sight because it's below sea level.
I love that you use the iceberg analogy because I know that you very generously and graciously purchased a copy of my book, When Men Buy Sex, Who Really Pays? And I don't know if you've dove into it yet, but if you have, in the first little part of it, oh, there's the book.
And all my bookmarks.
Oh, nice. So, okay, so you've definitely then reached the page that has the iceberg analogy. And that is so similar. Like with our iceberg analogy, we talk about sex work ideology and how, I hate using this term, but it kind of conveys what I need to say, is like the happy hooker, the very self-actualized sex worker, so to speak. And those are the people at the tip of the iceberg that everyone sees and they think everything's fine. But there's this massive, massive chunk of ice under the water that is all of the trafficking, all of the economic coercion, the desperation, the prior child sexual abuse, trauma, everything. So that, I think, also links to what we're talking about with media and those distorted perceptions of what's actually going on in these situations and who's actually being affected by it. So when I was reading your book, like I said earlier, I saw just so many parallels for the survivor community in the prostitution system. And I really loved that in chapter 6, you talk about this playbook that the church has, that they use when they respond to allegations of abuse. And there was 7 procedures that you name here. And the first 5 are exactly what we see in excusing commercial sexual exploitation. So those 7 procedures of this playbook that you mentioned are, first one is using euphemisms. The second one is not doing any type of investigation. The third one is creating phony excuses. Fourth one is continuing to support the accused person. The fifth one is no engagement with police, not contacting them in any way. And then 2 that were specific to clergy abuse, which is transferring the abuser to a new parish, and then also hiding the reasons for the transfer. So as I read that, I was just like, it was just so, oh my gosh, the parallels of abuse and how these systems, whether that's prostitution or clergy abuse, they all kind of operate with a lot of these gaslighting type actions that really serve to protect abusers and undermine the voices of survivors to bring these issues to light. So were those 7 procedures that you just kind of observed over the years that they do through your work? Or have you heard this from others where you came together and it was decided like, yeah, this happened to all of us and there's this uniform energy to it? Or how did you, I guess, kind of pinpoint that these are the 7 procedures of their playbook that they use? Because I thought that was so fascinating and really well laid out.
Oh, well, thank you. I think part of it is 2 different things, is that when you read widely, others point out different aspects of it because we share a similar experience. And again, with personal experience, I think I can't claim that I was the only one to point out one or the other, because I think they're true in the experience of other researchers, other victims, other advocates. And it's just sort of compiling these together in one list.
So you're the guy that just put it down on paper and brought it together.
Yeah.
That's what we need, right? Is a lot of times we understand these things, but we need someone to actually formulate it and put it there and say, here it is. And then it's a point of reference later for others to make more sense of it.
There's a great quote of, we stand on the shoulders of giants, meaning that there's so many before us who have given us insights and wisdom and knowledge, and we gain or benefit from their contributions to the world.
Now, I wonder, why is it, do you think, that despite whistleblowers such as yourself and so many other courageous survivors who have done so, why is there this reluctance for society to actually have these conversations? Do you think it's because we live in a patriarchy? Do you think it's because it's not a palatable conversation, like a dinner table talk? Do you think it triggers people and people want to avoid talking about it? People are self-focused and maybe not community-oriented? Is it all of the above? Like, what do you really think is kind of that sticking point that stops people from really holding these institutions accountable and saying harm is happening under your watch? And not only are you not addressing it, you are actively circumventing and going around the narrative and really trying to hinder the work of those who are bringing these issues to light. I'm curious what you think is kind of that issue that we're still not yet overcoming, it seems.
Well, I think there's 2 things, 2 P's, power and patriarchy. They're both connected. But we come from centuries-long tradition of patriarchy, and we see it manifested in who controls companies, who controls media, who controls the churches, who controls ideological apparatus of society. And we could see that patriarchy is a common theme. And this is equivalent or the same of where power lies within society. If we look at corporations, what percentage of women running the corporations, or what percentage of wealth women have vis-a-vis men, or their ability to control corporations. Well, then we could look at the same thing at universities. We could look at the same thing at churches. I mean, the Catholic Church, God, they're just all men. So they control this apparatus of belief within society. They maintain and reproduce patriarchy and manifest it in their own system of the Pope and bishops and priests of being all powerful and excluding women. So they're tied together in the fabric of society. And the point is that excludes or buries the voice, the interests of those that are not men and don't have power, don't have money. So the system reproduces itself. Now, obviously, we're a challenge to it, and others are a challenge to it. Other mechanisms are a challenge to it. Women's liberation of the 70s was a giant challenge and quite liberating for society. It still has an impact. So it's a power struggle, but there are mechanisms, philosophical, theoretical, political, ideological, that maintain and reproduce a system of patriarchy and power.
That was a very fantastic response. I don't think I could have sat down and written something better than how you explained that. It's like off the cuff. It's pretty hard to say things. Sometimes I can come up with some pretty good stuff writing, but just off the top of your head, that was just so eloquently stated and really spot on. And yeah, I often sometimes think, well, maybe if all these things were happening en masse to men at the rate that they were happening to women and girls, that we would see a shift in that public attitude and that collective conscious. But we know that males, when they're boys, they're victimized as well too. And it's always kind of, I guess, shocked me a little bit that doesn't bother the system, so to speak. Like, oh, this is happening to the males as well as the females. And I always kind of thought, well, that'll be what tips the scale, is when adult men can see harm happening to their fellow males, even if it's male children, right? But it hasn't, unfortunately. And so it's really, I think, goes back to what you said about, is men running the world and kind of leading society, and anybody who is not an adult male, even a child who's a male, they're still prone to being dominated by adult men under a patriarchal system. So I think there isn't really much that we can do when it comes to trying to tilt this in a gendered sense, so to speak. It has to really come from a collective consciousness where we care about everybody the same, rather than just, okay, you're an adult male or you're not. You're either in or you're out of this system. And something that, again, from your book that I drew quite a parallel with around the commercial sex industry was in chapter 2, how you talked about kind of your earlier days with SNAP and how you would go to some of these churches and protest some of the priests who were being accused of abuse, and how at times the parishioners would come out of Sunday Mass and were just in such disbelief that their, nice religious parish priest was accused of abuse, and they would accuse you and your friends and your allies, the survivor community, of being Catholic haters and agents of Satan, among other insults. And you said occasionally it even got to the point of people pushing and shoving you as they passed. Like, that really shocked me, but didn't shock me, because I've been on the back end of things too, of challenging sex work ideology and the patriarchy, and being told that I'm the problem as someone who's sounding the alarm. So that was, again, another parallel that I drew with our shared stories of overcoming abuse. But how does that feel when you can see these issues, and you so eloquently detailed it, like I said just a few moments ago, but people can't see it? And even when you're taking the information right to them and you've got the person there willing to say, this happened to me, the disbelief of survivors just seems to be so strong that we, again, don't pay any attention to the institution and what the message is that's being raised, but we just direct all the attention onto the victims and the survivors and vilify them instead. I've seen that in my space, and I often think that that's because there's money involved. But in your situation, it's not a commercial transaction, so to speak. It's just direct child abuse. And even with that, people are still resistive to believing survivors. And so why do you think that is? Is that just like the power of the patriarchy machine that we struggle to break through that narrative? Why is there so much attention paid to the whistleblowers and vilification of them, but not to what the message is that they're bringing forth?
I think there's a transition in society. And again, when I started in 95, our movement was very young, and people protesting about sexual violence was very new outside of the women's movement. Obviously, the women's movement had been very strong fighting against rape, college rape, etc. But when I stepped forward in 95, there was a great amount of hostility from the parishioners because they couldn't believe that their wonderful parish priest would do such a thing. However, after the Pennsylvania grand juries, after the Spotlight series in the Boston Globe, and then the movie Spotlight, parishioners began to understand that there was a significant problem with sexual abuse. And the number of people that had gone to church in the Catholic faith had dropped dramatically because of the change of understanding of sexual violence within society. So to me, it was a dramatic change from when I started until now. There's been a shift where people now accept Epstein, Weinstein, Catholic abuse, abuse within the Baptist community. People understand that within these institutions, there is sexual violence. And so those institutions have taken a step down from what I would say their exalted position, and there's more questioning of that. So I think there's been a cultural shift, which I welcome, but we still see that there's a long, long way to go.
Yeah, that is so true. And, I've been very fortunate that I've got feminist elder women in my corner who are in their 70s and 80s. And when I turned 30 and I was fairly recently exited from the prostitution system, I connected with those women and they kind of really became my rock in my community and, validated what I had felt that I had never had other people in any space validate. They often say the same thing too, like, there's still a long way to go, but you really cannot understand the gravity of like the shift that has already happened. It's really been quite monumental. But I think whenever you just kind of jump onto the scene at a certain point, you don't know the history of all of that and the good work that has been done and how much work survivors have done to make that be the shift that has come about. And so I try to not get jaded and think, there's no hope and these things will never change. And this is just how it is, which is, I think, easy to slip into that mindset and that trap, so to speak. But I've really tried to keep it in perspective that change takes a long time and it's, really difficult to change everything at once. Institutions, social understandings, people's sentiments in relation to those other shifts happening. It really is a process. So it's, really remarkable how long you have dedicated to raising awareness about this and kept your positive spirit about the potential for hope and change to occur and for us to have a different environment and energy in our society going forward. And I think that must have taken you a lot of work to get to that point where you feel that kind of inner strength that you can carry on every day amid all the news stories that you probably hear regularly from people who are newly coming onto this cause of advocacy.
Well, I believe that a couple of things. We find evidence of the hundreds of organizations that have formed since the year 2000. So, like the civil rights movement or the women's movement or the environmental movement, these movements sort of exploded onto the scene. The same thing with the survivors, that they created all these organizations, all these opportunities for us to fight back politically or legislatively or provide education and support groups. So the movement of survivors are winning. Obviously, we haven't won yet, but we have made dramatic changes. In the United States, there's been changes in statute of limitation laws in 30 states. We've seen more evidence of acceptance of survivors and survivor stories. And again, we see evidence in the recent Epstein explosion that has given quite a bit of notice to the abuse of these women by Epstein. So we're winning. We just haven't won yet. So got to continue to work.
Yeah, like you said in chapter 7 of your book, survivor advocates win many battles, but have not yet won the war. That's very true, right? It's the little battles, but eventually the war gets won through those small little battles of us showing up and sounding the alarm and doing the heavy lifting and moving that social needle. And, I think also in this space too, people often want to turn to just money as a silencer. And, there's a lot of lawsuits or non-disclosure agreements, payoffs, if you will. And that's probably, I'm assuming, the preferred route of many abusers to go that way because they can buy their victim's silence. But you say in chapter 6, how can you place a dollar amount on a lifetime of depression, low self-esteem, sadness, iron hot anger, and other PTSD symptoms? And that really, I think, says it all. And that's actually the line where I read red hot anger. And I thought, yes, how can you think that just handing somebody a check erases all of the harm that's been done and then the consequences of that harm throughout their lifetime until they come forth to actually bring this to somebody? And then what will come in the future, even if they have that money in the bank, it doesn't erase it. So in your book, you talk about what you think are the 4 major healers for people. And I'm curious to kind of hear about what of those have been really the most impactful for you as an individual. And so the 4 healers that you mention are family support, professional therapy, peer groups, and engaging in activism. And I know you also talk about doing EMDR, which is it's a type of therapy for our listeners that might not be familiar. It's called eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And you say that this is the most courageous thing actually that you have ever done is EMDR therapy. So I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about what healing looks like for you and also what you've seen healing for others. Like, has what worked for you been relatively universal to help other people? Those 4 key things: family support, therapy, peer groups, and engaging in activism? Or do you think that healing is really very, very unique in that people may draw from some of those things, but not others, or maybe don't do any of those things and find healing through another potential route?
Well, the way I look at it is not as individual things, but a fabric. In other words, they're hard to separate. They're part of my whole self. All of them have been instrumental in my healing. I'll start with the therapy. I took therapy on and off for many years. As I said, I've been a survivor for 60 years. I got it.
You don't look that old, Tim.
I have to do the calculations here. So EMDR was incredibly helpful. I did that therapy when the worst memories came forward. And it's a very difficult therapy. But the therapy involves bringing forward memories of the abuse. And the theory behind EMDR, as I understand it, is if you have these memories that you're pushing down, they're always going to impact you. So you can't bury them. No matter what you do, you can't bury them. They're always going to be pushing into your actions, whether in anger or depression or sadness or whatever. So EMDR requires you to bring those memories forward. Now, I'm going to get into an EMDR moment here. I suffered very violent sexual abuse, and I buried that. And so talking about that, even now, 60 years later, it's very hard. But bringing that memory forward made it part of who I am, as opposed to a memory that I needed to keep forcing to bury. So by bringing it forward, EMDR liberated me from, all those horrific memories. And as I mentioned before, allowed me to begin to control my own life. So EMDR was incredibly helpful. And I didn't start that until I was 63, I think, when the worst memories came forward. And I highly recommend it. But I have talked to many, many survivors, many who have been helped by EMDR and many who feel that they couldn't continue the process for whatever reason. So it's mixed, and obviously it's a very personal kind of approach. Because obviously people addressing sexual violence in their past, sometimes use meditation or yoga or other forms of therapy. There's a dozen different kinds of therapy. But I found EMDR is incredibly helpful and part of my healing. So that was one thread of that fabric, was EMDR, being very liberating, and I became my true self, not burdened by that past.
Tim, you had said that you had done therapy before that. Was it all just talk therapy that you had done prior to that? And then you just found that that didn't bring it out the same way that doing some type of somatic therapy, like of taking the trauma out of the body, so to speak. And I don't know if I worded that the right way, but yeah, you did such a good job talking about bringing it up, but integrating it into yourself in a healthy way. What do you think was different about that versus just talk therapy?
I think in talk therapy, I was so beat down, if you will, that I couldn't express the harm. If you have self-blame, if you have low self-esteem, it was incredibly hard to, I shouldn't even say it was hard because I didn't even do it, share other than superficially with any therapist. So I don't want to demean therapists, but it was meaningless. And it was EMDR that forced me to bring these memories forward, make them part of who I am so I can act on the world. As I said, it's a fabric. I mean, if you remove one thread from a fabric, then you sort of lose all of it. But I've been participating in support groups, from 95 to about 98. First came into some memories, and then had children, my twin daughters. I'm blessed with children. And then when they came 8 and I went to the EMDR, then I committed full-time to SNAP and SNAP support groups. And I've done monthly support groups since 2008 till today. Now I do 2 support groups a month, but until most of the time it was just once a month. And these are peer support groups. There's no leader, so it's based on the AA model, survivors supporting each other. So there's not like someone guiding us or pushing us or whatever. It's mutual support, and it's very healing. And we started off earlier with this meeting about your story is my story. When you go to a support group, their story is my story. It's probably the same thing with those that participate in AA. Their story is my story. So support group has been incredibly healing. Now, how long I've been doing support groups? 20 years, 30 years.
A remarkable amount of time either way.
I still find them important as part of my healing. Yeah, so support groups are incredibly important. And activism. When I was abused as a child, I did nothing. I said nothing. I froze. I mean, I don't even know how to explain it. I was there. I was just sort of like a doll. I was treated like a doll. And my response was nothing. And when the rape was different, because it was very, very violent. But that was more where I was controlled. But in both sense, I had no control. I had no self-action. So being an advocate is a way to act, whereas when I was a child, I couldn't or didn't act. So now I have the ability to do something, to act. So I'm very much an activist in any way, shape, or form that I can. Tied to the support, I think the third one was on peer support.
Yeah, family support, professional therapy, peer groups, and engaging in activism. So yeah, just that family component, I guess, too.
Yeah, the family. That is interesting because when I was a child, 12 years old, I withdrew. My family didn't know anything, did horribly in high school, joined the Army. Only later, when I came into the memories, I told my parents, and this was the first that they understood, but I wanted them to know, my journey and what was happening and things like that. So it was incredibly important for telling my parents and then telling my 10 brothers and sisters about my abuse. It was important for sort of like a pebble in the pond, starting from the center of sharing my story with my family, my experience, and what happened to me. Getting that support. And another major element was the support I received when the memories of my rape came forward. I was married. My children were 8 years old. My wife at the time, I'm divorced. My wife at the time gave me incredible support. And my children, even though they were 10, 12 years old, also gave me incredible support. So again, if we look from the center out, I had the support of my family. And I know that I'm fortunate because sometimes families are not supportive of when people come forward as a victim. So I'm very fortunate. And then I told each of my brothers and sisters individually. I didn't want to make a group announcement. I told them individually, my story and my experience. And it helped them understand, my history within the family and, the troubles I went through and et cetera. So those are kind of the four pillars of me being able to be an activist, to speak up, to challenge the powerful. And I've been to the Vatican twice as part of a SNAP contingent and to raise the issue.
Yeah, that's incredible. And did you feel like when you went there, it was well received? Like, do you feel like doing all this healing work that you went there and stood in your power, or did you feel like it kind of fell on deaf ears? I know you mentioned in your book talking about the residential school system here in Canada, which was really an action of government partnering with the Catholic Church to quote unquote rid the Indian out of the child of the Indigenous peoples of Canada. And I know, I don't even know how long, decades, there's been survivors of the residential school system trying to get the Pope to issue an apology for what was done. And I think it was probably about 5 years ago that actually happened. And people were shocked that it happened because everybody said, well, if they admit to it, it's going to be major lawsuits, and shame upon the church and on Catholicism and everything. So did you find that was affirming to you, or do you feel like it didn't really hit the mark? I'm curious, because really that's going to the top. That's going all the way to take that message. So I do hope it was well received and that you were heard in your power in that moment, in those two moments.
No. I mean, as far as in relation to the church, no, there's little expectation that the church would step forward, either as the grand Vatican or worldwide system. There was no immediate kind of response. But one of the reasons that survivors have been successful, and that is media. So when we do, as I mentioned about me in Iowa, 50 years after I abused, I had a press conference. And then, of course, 12 people came forward and said I was abused too. When we're in the Vatican, we had hundreds of interviews of newspapers worldwide. This brought quite a bit of attention. So each of those provided an opportunity to reach people. And a dramatic example of the power of the media is the gymnasts. One gymnast stepped forward, and then immediately after that, because of the media, 200 other gymnasts stepped forward. So when we step forward, we use the Vatican as a platform to reach peoples of the world so that they understand that people are fighting back, that there are survivors, that you're not alone, that there's abuse within the church. So going to the Vatican was incredibly important as far as doing that. And just going to the Vatican was an opportunity to reach world media, an opportunity to demonstrate to people everywhere that they're not alone, that sexual violence happens within the church, and that the church has been covering it up for many, many decades, if not centuries.
Well, I'm very sorry to hear that it wasn't, 100% well received with good action taken. And I hate to say, I think that's, sadly expected in a patriarchal world like what we talked about, and with these institutions that have a lot to lose and don't want to have egg on the face, so to speak. But yeah, I think it's very important that we continue to challenge institutions. And I really liked what you said in chapter 8, that institutions are complicit because they provide the access, the authority, and the status to exploit. So I think it is important to, even if we're not breaking down the door and making big change on that institutional level, still trying to hold their feet to the fire and bring some form of accountability, or at the very least, visibility of what they're doing to the public conscious. So I applaud you for going there, even though I imagine it was probably triggering to, walk away and sometimes wonder, did I actually make an impact in doing that? And I know myself, I felt that, countless times in the work that I do, where people say to me, well, you did all that you could do and you raised the alarm and you did that, and you can't expect everything to change overnight, but you put one more drop in the puddle, so to speak, and there will be a ripple effect somewhere down the line of it. Well, I know I've kept you for, over an hour now, and I want to really just wrap up with, in your book, you have the 7 calls to action, which, again, after reading so much of this heavy stuff throughout your book, I think it really finished it off so strongly and so motivating, and, encouraging for people who are like, wow, this is really heavy. This is a big issue, but what can I do as just the average person in the world? So the 7 calls to action that you brought forth are a national survivors convention, like a gathering of survivors, legislative reforms, particularly around statute of limitation legislation around reporting sexual violence and crimes of the like, combating child marriage, investigations by state and civil society. This one I really, really like, addressing AI generated abuse, as that is so present day and really timely. And then the last 2 were ratifying important international conventions like the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, and also just keeping up with public demonstrations and keeping that in the public conscious, these conversations. So I'm wondering, with your 7 calls to action, are you seeing these things happening to a degree that you think they should be, or are we still just really in infancy for taking on some of these things? Like, I know we don't have a national survivors convention happening really in any form of abuse. I know it's not happening in my area of activism, and as far as I know, it hasn't yet happened in yours. But is there anything that you think is really kind of getting the ball going really good, or where do you see hope in those calls to action that we're actually going to see change, or that we're starting to already?
Well, it's a big question, and it's kind of a conclusion of sorts of, if we see it in the analogy of a war, we're engaging in all these battles. We need to continue to engage in all these battles. And again, I'm very optimistic and positive, and I believe my book is very positive in saying, yes, we're winning this war, but we still have all these battles. And we don't win every battle, but we've won quite a few, and we continue to win. Concerning the convention, we saw the Women's Convention in, I think it was New York in 1869 or something like that. There was a women's convention that sort of announced the women's movement and whatever. And that was sort of the genesis of, we need a starting point for the survivors movement. So far, we're a collection of 250 organizations, but pretty much all of them are siloed, individual with their own kind of missions, their own objectives and whatever. But I believe that if we form a movement, we begin to expand dramatically our social power, our political power, our ability to change society. So just as the women's movement or the environmental movement or exploded on the scene, so has the survivors movement. So I believe that we do need to have an international conference of survivors to use the power that we have, but by bringing together and consolidating our messages, that will gain more power politically, culturally, and through social action. I've begun that process, but haven't gotten too far. Those interested can contact me, of course. But basically, the beginning efforts have been to focus on contacting and engaging organizations that are now doing the work, and to have them see that forming a national convention, forming the beginnings of a movement, of solidifying as a movement, will be beneficial to them as an organization, that they have more to gain by working with others in coalitions and associations than it is simply by working themselves. Now, there are a fair number of coalitions and associations, but we need to expand those efforts across the hundreds of national survivor organizations.
It's hard to bring people together when there's so many groups already and everyone's really focused kind of typically on their jurisdiction and what they're doing. But you're right. Like you want to go far, you team up with everybody. I think there's a saying actually, it says something like, if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go together. I can't remember who said that. It's somebody way wiser than me. I just draw from that. But it's true, right? And I found that too in my work as well. Like I was able to do quite good things as a lone wolf activist, but now in my more recent years, I've really tried to focus on partnership with others. And I found that work not only rewarding and supporting because it makes me feel less alone and I feel more a sense of community in the work I do, but I actually also think it really takes the work farther and has greater impact than if we just go at it alone. So I think that's a fantastic, really good thing that we need to make happen. And if it ever does happen and you have your first event, please send me an email because I would love to come and attend and just learn more about, everybody in this space and the really great work that you're all doing because it's just very life-changing and impactful. So I'm wondering, Tim, with all the wealth of information that you've brought our way today, is there anything that you want to leave with our listeners as a final word? I know there's so much more to say. And again, I'm going to go back and say, everybody, please buy Tim's book because you will learn so much more than you were able to in just this short time that we had him with us today. But is there anything that you want to leave with our listeners, kind of a wrapping up of all of this, so to speak?
Yes, I would. I have a website. The website name is standupspeakup.org. In that website, I have hundreds of citations as well as a listing of the hundreds of survivor organizations. So there's a lot of resources that a survivor can use. How do you talk to a survivor? What do you say to someone that's been a survivor? And studies. So there's a wealth of information to share. So standupspeakup.org. Thank you.
That's great. Well, thank you, Tim. I know you're also active on Twitter or X, but I don't know if you want people to follow you there as well, or if there's any other social media accounts that you have, or if those are linked to your website, standupspeakup.org, where people can follow you more in live time or engage with you directly, or do you prefer it all be done through your website?
Yeah, contact information is on my website and everywhere, but I am active on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, Blue Sky. So as an advocate, I believe it's important to be engaged in all these different social medias. Sometimes it can be consuming and distracting, but I believe that we need to be engaged. And there's dozens of other organizations you'll see on my website that provide resources.
Well, that's great. Thank you. And you're really just such a central hub of information and insight and all the things that people, need to hear and learn about this. Like you're really a one-stop shop for it. And I really want to, again, tip my hat to you for all the remarkable work that you've done and, the challenges that you've overcome and how you've just, as I said in the beginning, really transformed a lot of hard instances and experiences into this beautiful, empowering and inspiring movement for survivors. And so again, I can't thank you enough for spending time with us today and for really all the work that you do and continue to do and that I'm sure you will continue doing in the future going forth with all the passion that you bring to this. So thank you again, Tim, for joining us.
And thank you. Thank you for your kind words and thank you for your wonderful interview. You're so marvelously prepared and engaging for this hour or hour and a half. And so quite impressive. And I thank you very much.
It's really who you have on that makes it as good as it is. So thank you again. All right, listeners, thank you for joining us again. Please, if this conversation was difficult or triggering, do practice self-care, reach out. Again, visit Snap's website, Tim's website, standupspeakup.org. There's a lot of resources that are there for you, and we look forward to having you on our next episode of Red Light Exposé. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
We hope you found this episode informative. To follow us on social media, click the links in the show notes below. If there is a topic you would like us to cover, you can contact us at redlightexposé.podcast@gmail.com or head on over to our website, redlightexposé.com. There you can also find a donation page if you'd like to support the show. All the hosts at Red Light Exposé are volunteers, so we rely on your donations to continue to compensate our survivor guests and cover operative costs. Thank you for listening. We hope you tune in next time.